Good afternoon. We're going to do this panel a little different than the ones that came before. I'm going to do very brief intros for the folks here because you've got bios in the journal. And then mostly we're going to do a Q&A, and the idea, what we'll do at the end is we're going to leave a fair amount of time for questions at the end, because my sense is that this issue, it seems to me that there are really sort of two issues that one has to deal with when you think about this as a potential investor. First is the sort of background conversation frequently has been, is there a cost to investing with an ESG orientation? I think we've got some pretty good information that suggests that there's not. The other 800-pound gorilla in the room is this, is that if you take these things into consideration, are you in some way violating your fiduciary responsibility? And what my view about this is, and I'm going to let these folks talk more than myself here, is that if you don't take these issues into consideration, you're violating your fiduciary responsibility. So we're going to provide a bunch of information. Each of these folks, and I'll introduce them in a second, have written very thoughtful and interesting articles about this, and I would encourage you both to reach out to them directly and find the articles as a way of getting academic and intellectual support for broadening this conversation. So it was an intro, and we're going to dive into the questions. Furthest over is Keith Johnson. Keith is a lawyer in Wisconsin, and he has been an advisor to SWIB, which is the State of Wisconsin Investment Board. It's their, I'll be playful since I'm from California, it's their version of CalPERS. Susan Gary and I share, she works at the University of Oregon, she's a professor there. It's my alumni, one of my alumni, but, or alma mater, excuse me. She has worked with the group that has been involved in rewriting and updating what's called UPMIFA, which is the uniform law that deals with the investment by non-for-profit corporations of their endowment monies. And she's deeply steeped in this area. And Jay and I laughed when we talked with each other on the phone first. He too is a lawyer. He comes to this work from having worked mostly as an advocate for labor unions and working folks, and as a result becoming involved with their VBAs, their employee benefit plans as a trustee, and has had to think about this from the standpoint of taking a look at this. And both he and Keith in particular will talk about the need to do a sort of a long live look at how you invest your money. So with that said, I'll dive into the questions. Susan, let's start with the foundational one. Can you talk a little, sort of define what it means to be a fiduciary?
Yes, the fiduciary duties that most apply in this area are the duties of loyalty and the duty of prudence. The duty of loyalty is the one that I looked at some time ago in connection with socially responsible investing. The duty of loyalty is the duty of the trustees or directors of trustees of a trust or the directors of a charitable corporation to act always in the best interest of the beneficiary. So for a charity, that's the charitable purpose. For a university, that's the university's mission. And we're going to talk more about that and how that relates to this. But the university's mission is a little fuzzy, a little hard to pin down, and it makes that duty of loyalty a little bit hard to apply in the university context. All that duty says is that the beneficiaries can't act in a way that puts the interests of someone else above the interests of the beneficiaries of the mission. The other duty is the duty of prudence, and the duty of prudence is to act as a prudent investor. The Prudent Investor Act has been enacted in most states, applies to trust, and UPMIFA applies the duty to act as a prudent investor to charities organized particularly as corporations. And what's interesting to me thinking about the prudent investor rules, and we're going to get into that in this panel, is prudence is an evolving concept. It's not a concept that is fixed in time, and if it were, we would all still be investing based on lists put forward by the legislatures, because that's the way it used to work, and that's not what prudence means today. And what I discovered in doing a lot of reading in preparation for being here today is that the duty of prudence is evolving very rapidly in this area. One more thing with respect to mission investing, or with respect to duty of loyalty and mission, when I looked at this issue a few years back, I was focused on the duty of loyalty and the concern about mission, and concluded that a charity could invest in a way that furthered its mission. So if we can figure out what the mission is, we can further the mission. And I've been jotting down ideas of ways that we can frame a university's mission to include ESG factors in investment, but it's hard to do. What I'm excited about is I think that becomes less of a concern if being a prudent investor means, as David just said, means taking into consideration ESG factors. It may be that the focus is shifting from this concern about, is it related to mission sufficiently, to what does it mean to be prudent?
Jay, over the last 10 or 15 years, one of the articles you wrote talks about how the thinking on fiduciary responsibility has evolved. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I came at this really from being a lawyer for benefit funds and having to advise trustees on what fiduciary duty was, and then as a trustee myself. And I'm now a trustee, and so I have a fiduciary duty on 5 separate funds, most in the labor areas. And so the kind of the joke is that the thing the lawyer does on your fund is tell you no. So you say you want to do something, no, can't really do that. Or, oh, you might get sued. And so we call them the Dr. No lawyers. And so I was trying to figure out why was that? Because as Susan and I were talking earlier at the break, there's not really a lot of cases that say that. The law is aspirational in some ways in these areas. And so I went back and did some historical research on fiduciary duty and investment. So if you're a trustee, you have an overall fiduciary duty for all of the fund. Susan talked about some of the core foundations of them. You can't have a conflict of interest. You have to be loyal to your fund and to the beneficiaries. But what it turns out is that how to apply those concepts is quite dynamic, and that it's changed in extraordinary amounts during the 20th century. I mean, 25 years ago, everything that most endowments are doing in terms of investment would not have been allowed. You could not invest according to the restatements of trust in a risky investment. Well, now we consider that almost every investment has some risk, and we try to quantify the risk. So there's been this extraordinary change. The principles haven't changed. Your duties of loyalty and prudence and care, they haven't changed. But how you apply them absolutely changed, and they're historical. And so what it means is that each of you who is on a fund has the ability to think about how you want to invest and to make prudent decisions. Now, one thing it means is you have to go through a proper procedure. So I always say the minutes need to look good. You need to think about the things you're doing. You need to be very, very intentional. I like the fact that this conference is called, has the word intentional in it. But if you are, you have extraordinary freedom. Fiduciary duty does not stop you from doing that. And I would make one pitch to this group, that is that in some ways as university endowments, you have more freedom in terms of fiduciary duty than many other institutions for several reasons. One, you have multiple stakeholders. 2, you are a long-term investor, and we've had a lot of discussion about that. But you want your college to be around forever, and you want your endowment to be around forever. And what happens in 3 months is frankly not that important in the grand scheme of things. Third, you don't just, like in California, for example, there's an argument for the California fund sometimes that says, well, we've got to really just think about California. And so in our kind of fiduciary duty and investment, we have to think about that. You have students that go all over the world. So your investments that you make are going to affect the things they do. There's a tremendous debate now about what it means to invest in land in Africa. I'm sure you have students who are from Ghana, who are from South Africa, who are from Liberia, and how those countries are changed by investments from the wealthy is going to have a major effect on civil society. Your investments have a big effect on that. And as Dave said, now that we know from the morning of the conference that ESG is a very prudent kind of investment strategy, if you get a no from your Dr. No, maybe you consider getting another lawyer. And not a pitch for me, or Keith.
Keith, the management company at the Harvard Endowment recently published a position paper that stated, quote, an endowment is a resource, not a political instrumentality. A position that in essence says that any consideration of ESG type screens when investing is inconsistent with one's fiduciary responsibility. How would you respond to that view?
Well, to me, that is a clear misunderstanding of, number one, what ESG issues are. If they are handled prudently, as we've all heard, basically, it doesn't mean that you have to give up returns. Number two, it really misconstrues what the obligations are of fiduciaries. And one of the things I like to, the Common Fund has in their investment policies a statement which I find really, really meaningful. It says, the trustees of endowment institution are the guardians of the future against the claims of the present. And that really, I mean, to me, basically hones in on one of the fundamental fiduciary duty aspects of the duty of loyalty, which Susan has mentioned. And that is sort of, in the pension fund context, you talk about intergenerational fairness. In the endowment context, you really have to balance the needs of the future and trying to invest in a way that is consistent with the future goals and mission of your institution, with the needs to generate current returns. So to the extent that you have ESG issues that are going to make the world a more costly place or more dangerous place, that are undermining the connection between what you are teaching and the kind of world that you're helping to build, I think you have a disconnect between your mission, your purpose, and the investment practices that you're involved in.
Jay, implicit in Harvard's view is that the idea that there is some sort of politics-free or principle-free investing. Would you care to comment on that?
Well, again, thanks for the softball at this conference. I very much appreciate the discussion of values. 2 or 3 years ago, this issue kind of came up, and so I wrote a little article on value and values and kind of tried to shop it around to some of the popular financial press, and did not get a very good reception. Finally was published in Pensions and Investment, but I'm very glad to see this kind of issue change. I think, in speaking to universities, if you went into any of your classes and said, oh, some activities are values-free, you'd get immediately pushback. I mean, what issues do we do, what things do we deal with in life in which they have no values embedded? Of course, they all have values embedded. So the question is not value or values, the question is which values. And I think for a university endowment, it's especially important to think about that. It's certainly true in the investing world. And these are hard questions. And one thing I'm very happy about this conference, I can see us moving on to kind of more and more complex questions. So let me give you some that are coming up now. If you look at private equity, probably many of your endowments are in private equity. There's a coming battle in terms of private equity and tax avoidance. There are some academics who claim that really the whole private equity industry is based on tax avoidance. And obviously, for many institutions and for society as a whole, wholesale tax avoidance is a major problem. If we're part of that, that's a major problem as well. And so the question is, can we discuss those kinds of things? A lot of y'all probably saw the Michael Lewis book, to take number 2 on this, what's called fast trading. And there's a proposal out there to put a minor financial transaction tax on each of these trades. Some pension funds in Europe have taken a position against that, mainly because they've been kind of lobbied by Wall Street types to say, oh, this would be bad, it's going to cut your returns in some ways. But if financialization is a problem in society, which I think most would think it is, what should endowments' positions be on a financial transaction tax? And then also on proxy voting. You had a lot of conversation about proxy voting here. We push, and the funds I'm on proxy voting a lot, but you really have to push your managers. And we have a position that if we are in a commingled fund and we have an important issue and they vote against us, then we're out of that fund. we'll find that there's enough, I was at a conference recently that said there are 76,000 financial products in the United States. You can leave a product and find another product. So those are the kinds of values issues that you as university leaders, pushed by students, can address. Many of y'all were leaders in the South African movement. I think you can be leaders in this as well.
I want to pick up something that you've said, Jay, which I think is really, really important. And this, I think, goes to the Yale letter, too. There is a behavioral bias that is evident in the response from the Yale president there. As Jay said, whose values are you talking about? When you make an investment decision, basically, you're implementing somebody's views of values and what the mission is that those investment decisions are going to make. I think the critical thing for fiduciaries is to go back and develop an understanding of what your investment beliefs are and how those investment beliefs relate to the mission of your organization, and to structure your investment program around there. It's very hard to do without behavioral bias because we as human beings tend to have our thinking anchored in whatever the most recent thing is that we've heard. And to the extent that you have a portfolio which holds certain assets or is benchmarked against a certain index, that creates a behavioral marker, which may or may not be in the best interests of the mission that you're trying to serve. We also have a behavioral bias to discount risk and to discount especially long-term risks. And it's a real challenge to get people to deal on a realistic, fact-based basis with long-term risks and things that are that depart from whatever they're anchored on. So I think that's, and fiduciary duty requires a process that deals with those issues on a fact-based basis.
I want to piggyback on that in one regard, which is that one of the things that's happened recently, and Susan, I want you to speak to this, is that recent changes in the law, the uniform laws, which are the laws that govern most states and how they deal in this, have shifted recently on how people should think about this. And Susan, you were really involved in that. Can you comment on that?
Sure. And we've talked already a little bit about this evolving concept of prudence. One of the things that's happened really over a relatively short period of time is thinking about what it means to be a prudent investor. There had been concepts in the law about what that meant before it became statutory. And in 1994, there was a first uniform statutory act on this, the Uniform Prudent Investor Act. One of the things that's interesting to know about that, those of you who are familiar with that, it applies to trust, but it's been used more broadly than that. The professor who served as the reporter for that act thought, and his views were informed by the South Africa movement, but thought that making investment decisions on anything other than a risk and return analysis was absolutely against fiduciary duty. So in the Uniform Prudent Investor Act, not in the statute, but in the comments, you will find an explicit mention of socially responsible investing that says this is absolutely not part of what a prudent investor does. That was 1994. In 2007, the Restatement Third of Trust was issued. It's been issued in pieces, but the piece that talked about what it means to be a prudent investor included a provision on charities that said, basically, investing in connection with mission may be, didn't say it should be, but may be prudent as part of that. And so there's a shift even with respect about what it means to invest in connection with mission. The other thing that's been happening, though, is, and the same professor who was the reporter and doesn't like SRI, was convinced that actually mission-related investing was okay. But the other thing that he always says about prudence is that it's an evolving concept. And this is what Jay was talking about. So The Uniform Prudent Investor Act is based on modern portfolio theory. It developed as an outgrowth of that. It relies very heavily on that theory. Prudence is moving beyond that, I think. And a lot of what we've heard this morning, the reason I'm so excited about this conference, is being able to understand more about different kinds of factors that can be taken into consideration. And if that's the case, then a prudent investor certainly can take ESG factors into consideration, and perhaps we're heading to a point where the prudent investor should take ESG factors into consideration. I will tell you that UPMIFA, which is the statute that applies to investments by charities and particularly endowments, we talked about socially responsible investing. Same professor was on that committee, and we decided not to address it. So it's not addressed directly in UPMIFA, but UPMIFA does say that a charity in investing its assets should consider its purpose and should consider the relationship any particular investment has to its purpose. So I think it clearly clearly that's just me talking, not as the reporter, but I think it provides a reassurance for investing related to mission. I think that's where I kept getting hung up with respect to universities, and I think now being a prudent investor makes it even easier. I'll just say one more thing. I was looking at mission statements from the Oregon schools. My own university's mission statement is being revised, and so I'm looking for opportunities. And I found the Oregon State University's mission statement, which says, in part, as an institution committed to teaching, research, and outreach and engagement, OSU promotes economic, social, cultural, and environmental progress for the people of Oregon, the nation, and the world. It then talks about how it does that through teaching students and research, but that's a very broad mission, which I think encompasses a lot of what we've been talking about.
Jane, Keith, you framed this as intergenerational neutrality. I want you folks both to comment on how a fiduciary should look at and think about the horizon for which they invest and how ESG plays in with that.
Well, if you read the latest Department of Defense quadrennial review, which is essentially the Department of Defense's sort of long-term planning document, it identifies climate risk as a major factor that the Defense Department and our military in the United States is going to have to deal with, basically. And it talks about the effects that climate change are expected to have in terms of potentially driving droughts and food scarcity and creating refugees and economic displacement and breeding grounds for terrorism. So I think that's, an example of trying to take the ramifications of investment decisions and challenging the investment managers with how do you respond to this kind of thing? Is this going to affect the real on-the-ground experience of the people that you're supposed to be investing for, the mission that you're supposed to be serving? The goal, I think, in fiduciary loyalty is to try to expand the analysis beyond just the portfolio and bring the analysis down to how it affects the ultimate program that is the mission of your organization.
On the issue of intergenerational equity, I've changed my mind a little bit on it because I came from a culture where, with kind of the 2007 crisis and kind of the attack on retirement security for public employees, I was very concerned about having benefits for folks now. I think, though, when you think about things in a long-term basis, we do have to think about the future generations. And certainly, that's unique in some ways to universities. And it gives universities and endowments even more of a reason to think in these kinds of long-term ways. It also, I think most of us would agree that one of the problems in society is today is that as a society we have a hard time thinking long-term. Climate change, politics, etc. And if we think of universities as places of learning and molding young minds, etc., being able to put those principles into our endowment and investment decisions, especially since we heard this morning that it's not a business case issue, seems to me to really in some ways be kind of a requirement of something you can do. Because one of the pitches I want to make to you is that our investments have a much bigger effect on society than we've realized. And I think that universities can be some of the first places to recognize that and to speak to that in a way that can influence folks throughout the investing community.
Okay, one last question, then I want to open up to the floor. Jay and Susan. Jay's written that trustees must observe issues of responsibility and sustainability in society and finance. Jay, can you elaborate on that a little bit more as you just did? Maybe go a little further than that. And Susan, can we weigh in on how UPMIFA and UPIA align or don't align with that proposition?
So I would I'd say a couple things and give it over to Susan. One is that it seems pretty clear, as I was just to follow up a little bit on what I was just saying, that through the current investment system, as investors, we've funneled a large amount of money to Wall Street. We now have 14% of something of the GDP comes from financial products. A number of years ago, it was 5%. And there is growing evidence that this financialization contributes to inequality, probably along with climate change, the two biggest problems our world is facing. And I think that in terms of thinking about our long-term investing, about the effects on society, the role of investors in financialization needs to be addressed. There's no easy answer to it right now, but certainly it's a place that can be thought about. The second thing I'd say on this is that each investor is a little bit different. So to give you an example of one of the very difficult things I wrestle with, I'm a trustee on a fund for workers who work fixing oil and gas plants in Louisiana and Texas. The more oil and gas plants there are, the more jobs they have. The more jobs they have, the more money goes into the system, the more is paid in for retirement. On the other hand, the more jobs they have, it probably means the more carbon's being burned. And that's not good for their kids, that's not good for their grandkids. And so one of the things that we're doing in our meeting is we're inviting folks to come to us and speak to the trustees, many of whom are industrial workers, some who are small business people, to speak about what it means to divest, what it means to engage, what it means to transition. And those kinds of societal issues are on the front burner for us, where a few years ago, we wouldn't even have thought about that. So.
Well, with respect to the statutes that now in most states govern these fiduciary duties, the statutes do two things. They start with a direction to consider purpose. And so I think the more that we can see the purpose of a university in the way that both Jane and Keith have talked about as a broader social purpose, supporting the students into the future, supporting research into the future. And one of the things that's been mentioned by other speakers is the university as a reflection of what it stands for in everything it does, not just teaching and research, but also in how it acts. We can see the purpose as concerned about climate change and concerned about these other social issues. That strengthens the discussion. In addition, both of those statutes then have a whole list of factors that a prudent investor considers, both factors that relate directly to that institution and then factors that relate more broadly to the economy. And so some of these issues about how these investments are going to affect the economy long term are very appropriately considered. I'll get back to something I think it was Jay who said is it's about process. For the trustees, the reassurance for the trustees, first of all, they're doing the right thing because the law says they can, but the other piece of the reassurance is to follow that process, to document that those factors were considered in making the decisions that were made, in crafting the policy that was crafted, because it's being thoughtful about that is what really matters from a legal standpoint, and maybe a way to keep the Dr. No lawyers from shutting things down.
Well, David, before we go to questions, I want to make sure that there's one clear message that's conveyed by the folks up on the stage here, and that is that fiduciary duty is definitely not a roadblock to integrating environmental, social, and governance factors into an investment program.
I would actually make a stronger statement than that. I think
And
that,
yes, but the second thing is that a balanced, full application of both the duty of loyalty, the duty of impartiality, and the duty of prudence essentially requires consideration of the kinds of ESG issues that are relevant to your mission. I find it interesting, currently there is a review of legal principles around fiduciary duty that's ongoing in Britain. And the UK Law Commission has issued a preliminary consultation that has given their tentative sort of conclusions. And one of their conclusions is basically that it's okay to consider ESG kinds of issues, and that investors are not tied to applying modern portfolio theory, that any theory that's well thought through, any approach that addresses the mission and concerns, obligations of the investor to its beneficiaries or to its mission is, if it's reasonably applied and thought through on a factual basis, is fine.
so let's open the floor here to questions.
From Yale, it's his comment in 1994 that leads to Dr. No. And it is almost impossible to get behind that. So it's somewhat distressing to me to hear that nothing has been done to remedy Professor No's Dr. No. It also, to anyone who has looked at the uniform laws with some background, looking at Professor No's comment, there is no reference to the City and County of Baltimore case. The City and County of Baltimore case is the only English language court of last resort review of the application of social screens to a pension fund portfolio. And it comes out in favor of it. And yet there is no mention in the comments to the Uniform Act of this case. I've heard Professor Langbine dismiss this, but that is the only case. Unless the commissioners act, all we're going to be hearing is Dr. No. And I'd like to know what is going on at the commissioners that's going to change this.
Can I take that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm not a commissioner. I was a reporter for UPMIFA, and that's been my role, so I'm afraid I don't have much sway. And Professor Langbine is a commissioner and has a very strong voice. I will tell you, though, I participated in a conference with him, and the article of mine that's in your list of materials on mission-related investing was my attempt to divide socially responsible investing much more broadly and mission-related investing, which was investing that I said, defined myself as investing related to mission. And at the conference, John was a commentator on my paper, and he did agree with me that mission-related investing was okay under UPIA, under the Prudent Investor Act. My goal coming out of this meeting is to write a follow-up article that will talk about all that we've talked about today, and my view that increasingly being a prudent investor, that concept has changed. I will tell you that getting John to change his mind is really, really hard. I considered it a triumph when he agreed that mission-related investing was okay, because he has very, very strong views on this, formed many decades ago. So yeah, I hear the frustration. I understand that.
Peter, a couple of things that I think are important in response to that too is there is, actually Jay and I have contributed chapters to a new handbook which is coming out from Cambridge University Press in a couple of weeks. It's called the Cambridge University Handbook on Fiduciary Duty and Institutional Investment. And one of the goals of that handbook, issued by a very respectable academic institution, is to provide support for exactly what we are talking about now. And we're hoping that it will provide something that can be used and referenced to support those kinds of arguments.
I wonder if we can turn the coin over and ask a question for a quick comment about what the responsibility of board members of corporations are. On the spectrum, the argument of the argument would be all the way from the role of the corporation is to, we hear this term, maximize return for share owners, all the way to the other end of the spectrum, which was enunciated very clearly at the Apple stockholders meeting a couple of weeks ago, where the CEO pushed back against a very conservative group that was there, urging the company to do nothing unless it had a clear return for the bottom line. He said, no, we're going to do some things because they're right and the responsible thing to do. If you're only wanting us to make decisions that affect the bottom line, especially short term, you should sell your stock. So any comments on what companies' fiduciary responsibility is, the board members of companies on this spectrum, whether it's maximizing profits or you can take other factors into account?
One of the problems with fiduciary duty is there are a lot of fiduciary duties. And so that's why in my writing I've tried to concentrate on fiduciary duty in investment. If you look at, and I'm not a corporate law professor, but in the writings that I've done on fiduciary duty investment, I've looked at fiduciary duty for corporations. And basically board members, the fiduciary duty is to do what they think they should do. And it's not much more than that. So people will get...
As long as they've disclosed it
Exactly.
accurately.
So it's one of the problems because people sometimes kind of mix them up. But boards of corporations have extraordinary ability to do whatever they want to do as long as they think what's the business judgment rule. They think it's the best for the business. And as we certainly know now, many consumers make their choices based on the reputation of a company, and that's a reputation often in terms of environmental factors or other factors. But it's frustrating for me as somebody who works with fiduciary duty for trustees to see what often the Delaware Chancery Court allows in terms of fiduciary duty for corporations. They're really two different things.
Yeah, and the fiduciary duty standards that apply to investment fiduciaries are much stricter than those that apply to corporate fiduciaries. And I think it's important also to keep in mind that shareholders and institutional investors actually play a different role in the corporate governance paradigm than management or directors do. I know the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development just released a piece of work that they did, a study that extolled sort of virtues and benefits to society of investors and shareholders playing an active, engaged role around the interests of their beneficiaries and how important that is for the success of a society and stability of the economy.
I'm curious as to the relationship between the fiduciary duty of trustees of the university relative to the consumption of endowment capital as compared to the management of capital. So, for example, after Hurricane Sandy, the New York Times reported that in no more than 300 years, approximately, most of Cambridge, Massachusetts would be underwater. So most of Harvard would be underwater. I'm assuming that what Harvard is doing right now on the ground in connection with what I mentioned earlier, the compact, the task force on zero, getting to net zero and so on, is all highly focused on Harvard's recognition that climate change presents a dramatic risk to its physical facilities and continued ability to function where it is. Well, let's assume that rather than 300 years, we're dealing with a potential flooding of Harvard in 100 years. And Harvard is currently spending significant capital to build facilities either that it itself owns or it jointly owns with other private parties, office towers, whatever. And the useful life of those buildings is not going to be what it used to be. So the question is the fiduciary duty of Harvard relative to the consumption of capital any different from the fiduciary duty for managing the endowment in the context of Harvard taking account of climate change risk?
Well, the fiduciary duty with respect to assets is kind of in two pieces, but in both cases, there's a duty of prudence because they're assets. And those office buildings might be investment assets, in which case MIFA would probably apply, depending. Or they might be dormitories for the students, in which case maybe they're not within MIFA, but the prudence standard is pretty much the same, which is that they have to take into consideration, this is getting back to what Jay says, kind of all the factors that would be appropriate. What's hard is to pin it down to a particular piece of that. And I think saying, well, should they be looking ahead? Yes. But if they're making a decision without looking ahead to predictions of flooding, it's going to be hard to hold anybody accountable, is my thinking. On the other hand, it would not be a violation of prudence to consider those factors. They should be considering those. It's just that it may not be at the level of liability if they don't. That's a mushy answer.
Okay.
We're close to time. We can just get in these last two questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Heidi Welsh from the Sustainable Investments Institute. So I have a question about the applicability of the work right now of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and what relevance it has to fiduciary duty for college and university endowments or more generally.
It's critical. I think that both the work of the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board and the the IRC, the Integrated Reporting Initiative, are front and center in terms of trying to shift the focus. In fact, one of the things that I think we'll start to see among some of the larger institutional investors, at least in the public pension community over the next few years, is integrated reporting being done by groups like CalPERS and CalSTRS. I know that there is some discussion of that occurring. I think that's really important to, again, break down the silos between investment activities and the rest of the program and try to put things together.
Briefly, I'm just curious if you think that the evolution of index funds commanding, majority of university endowment investments has led to complacency amongst fiduciaries, specifically allowing consultants, managers, attorneys to dictate prudence. And just as a follow-up, are there any recent judgments against academic trustees that you can think of?
So, along with Dr. No, the other standard line, at least in the labor funds, is if you do the wrong thing, they're going to take your house away. You have personal liability, and if you make a mistake, they're going to take your house away, so you better not really do anything. No house has been taken away. And there have been almost no, we were talking about this earlier, there are almost no cases in which trustees have been sued. I've been looking for some where trustees would be sued for not divesting. Somebody told me that somebody had filed one in Australia. I haven't really seen it, but so I think it's kind of a straw man on that. What was the other part of your question?
You said index funds.
Oh, so the index fund issue is interesting to me because, so I'm a trustee on some small funds. We don't have enough money people to engage, to do the kind of engagement work that like Tim Smith does. So we concentrate on fees. So we concentrate on trying to hold down fees, and so we index almost everything we can. The problem with indexing is, do you have an index that reflects ESG issues? And we saw from this morning that there are more and more of these, which I think is an excellent thing. So I think it's a common thing. I think it's a good thing. I don't think it gives more power to the service providers, although I do think that's something to always watch out for.
And there's no reason why you can't exercise proxy voting rights or engagement activities collectively. I think that's a challenge perhaps for this group, is to sort of collectively try to develop the mechanisms to, in a cost-effective way, better engage with companies, and also to develop the investment managers and advisors that are providing the kinds of services that you need instead of the kinds of services that they want to provide you.